The dust of the New Mexico territory was a language all its own. It spoke of endings and beginnings, of thirst and bone-weary travel. For the girl running, it was the taste of fear. It coated her tongue, gritted between her teeth, and settled in a fine red powder on her sweat-soaked dress, a garment already torn and thin enough to be a second skin. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath, each one a small victory against the screaming protest of her muscles. The sun was a hammer, relentless and unforgiving, beating down on the cracked earth and on her unprotected head. Behind her, somewhere in the shimmering heat haze, were the voices. They were not close enough to be distinct words, but she knew their timbre, their coarse, guttural quality. They were the voices of men who saw the world in terms of ownership, of weight and measure and coin. She had been an item in their ledger, a bargain struck over whiskey and a handshake. Now, she was a debt that had run off, and they were the collectors. Her escape from the Carrington mining camp had been less a plan and more a primal instinct, a sudden, violent snap of a tether that had been fraying for weeks, a moment of chaos, a drunken brawl, a tipped-over lantern, and she was gone, slipping through the canvas and timber labyrinth of the camp and into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert. She had no water, no food, nothing but the threadbare dress on her back and a terror so profound it felt like a living thing clawing at her insides. For 2 days, she had followed the distant, slow-moving caterpillar of a wagon train. She soon realized they weren't prospectors or traders. Their pace was solemn, their heads often bowed. In the quiet of the evenings, when the wind carried sounds for miles, she heard the faint, mournful cadence of hymns, pilgrims, people walking toward a God she wasn't sure she believed in, a God who had been conspicuously absent from her 18 years of life. She kept her distance, a lone coyote shadowing a herd of sheep. They were a shield. Her pursuers would be more cautious about riding into a large, organized group. But she knew it was a temporary reprieve. The pilgrims would not protect her if they knew what she was running from. To them, she would be a stain, a sin made flesh, a temptation to be cast out. She had seen that look in the eyes of righteous folk before. It was a different kind of cruelty, colder and cleaner than the miners, but it cut just as deep. So she walked in their dust, letting their passage obscure her tracks, her hunger a dull ache that had long since sharpened into a constant, gnawing pain. Her feet, wrapped in rags she'd torn from her hem, were a mess of blisters and cuts. The world had shrunk to this single, desperate focus: put one foot in front of the other, survive until the next sunrise. As the third day bled into evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange, purple, and blood red. The pilgrims began to make camp, their wagons circling like great, weary beasts. The air grew cooler, and the vast, crushing silence of the desert night began to descend. She knew she couldn't last another night alone. The cold would seep into her bones, and the last of her strength would abandon her. She needed help. She needed to make a bargain. Her gaze swept the perimeter of the camp, and then she saw him. He was separate from the main group, sitting atop a horse that was the color of midnight, a creature of immense size and power that stood with an almost unnatural stillness. The man himself was large, a silhouette against the dying light. He wore a long leather duster that fell past his knees, covering half the saddle. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing his face completely. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't tending to a fire. He was simply watching, an observer on the edge of the world. There was a stillness about him that was different from the pilgrim's solemnity. It was the stillness of a predator, of a rock, of something that had learned to endure by becoming a part of the landscape itself. Fear and desperation warred within her. The men from the camp were hunters. This man looked like one, too, but the ones behind her wanted to drag her back to a cage. This one was an unknown, and in the calculus of survival, The unknown was a better bet than the certainty of damnation. Her decision was made in the space of a single, shuddering breath. Her legs, stiff and trembling, carried her forward. She stumbled out from behind the scrub brush that had been her cover, her small frame looking even more fragile in the vast, open space. The horse shifted its weight, a soft snort cutting through the air. But the man didn't move. He had seen her long before she broke cover. He had been watching her all along. Every step was an agony. The gravel and thorns of the desert floor bit into her ravaged feet. The camp was 100 yards away, a world away. Here, there was only the approaching darkness, the silent man on his silent horse, and the pounding of her own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. She stopped about 10 feet from him, not daring to get closer. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, though his face remained a mystery of shadows. She could feel his eyes on her, a steady, unreadable pressure. She had to say something. She had to offer the only thing she had, the only currency she'd ever been taught she possessed. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked and bleeding. When she spoke, the word came out as a broken rasp, a sound more animal than human. "Mister," she began, her voice failing her. She swallowed the dust in her mouth and tried again, forcing the words out. They were words she had heard spoken in back rooms, words whispered as transactions were made, words that had defined her existence. She had rehearsed them in her mind, a shield against whatever was to come. It was a defense, a way to control the transaction, to name the price before it was named for her. "Do you want a virgin?" The question hung in the cold desert air, stark and ugly. It was a raw, desperate gambit, the plea of a creature who believed its own hide was the only thing of value it could trade. She stood there, braced for the reaction she expected: a coarse laugh, a leering appraisal, a negotiation. She was ready for him to ask the price, to tell her to turn around, to inspect the goods. The man was silent for a long moment. The silence stretched, becoming heavier and more profound than the vast emptiness around them. He didn't move a muscle, didn't shift in his saddle. She could hear the creak of leather, the soft sigh of the wind. In the gathering darkness, she thought she might have made a fatal mistake. Perhaps he would be offended. Perhaps he was one of the righteous ones after all. Then he shifted slightly. He didn't look down at her body, didn't seem to register the question as an offer of the flesh. His head tilted, and though she still couldn't see his eyes, she felt the full weight of his attention, not on her form, but on her face, on the desperation she knew must be etched there. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. It held no judgment, no mockery, and no eagerness. It held a weariness, perhaps, but also a strange and unnerving clarity. He didn't answer her question. He asked something of her instead, something so unexpected that her mind struggled to comprehend it. "I want your yes." The cowboy breathed, his voice a quiet rumble that seemed to be swallowed by the immensity of the night. He paused, letting the words settle around her, letting her feel their weight. Then he added, with a finality that closed all other doors, "And only that." She stared up at the dark shape of him, the words echoing in the hollow spaces inside her. Your yes, it was a foreign concept. No one had ever asked for her assent. Her body had been a commodity, her will an inconvenience to be broken or ignored. He wasn't accepting or rejecting her offer. He was discarding the entire premise of it, replacing her desperate bargain with a question of choice. And in that moment, standing under a canopy of stars that were just beginning to prick the velvet black of the sky, Clara felt a terror deeper and more bewildering than any she had felt while running from the miners. For the first time in her life, she had been offered something other than a price, and she had no idea what it meant. Her name was Clara. She had been told this at the St. Jude's Foundling Home, a gray, joyless building where names were given out like tin plates, functional and without sentiment. She was 18 years old. a fact she knew only because the man who had bought her from the orphanage, a portly fur trader with breath that smelled of stale tobacco and regret, had declared it so on her last birthday. He'd said it made her prime, a word he used for both pelts and people. Love, to Clara, was a word from a book she'd once seen a lady reading, its letters elegant and incomprehensible. In her world, there were no such abstract concepts. There was only value, price, and exchange. She was an object of trade, a line item in a ledger passed from one rough hand to another. Her life had been a series of transactions, each one stripping away another layer of whatever soul she might have been born with. From the foundling home, she had gone to the fur trader, who, when his fortunes turned, traded her to a saloon owner in a dusty Texas town for a gambling debt and a case of whiskey. The saloon owner, in turn, lost her in a card game to a prospector heading for the territories, and that prospector, after his claim ran dry, had sold her to the Carrington mining camp. No one, in all those years and all those transactions, had ever asked for her opinion. No one had ever paused when she'd whispered no, a word that became increasingly faint until it was little more than a silent thought, a useless flicker of defiance in the face of overwhelming force. The word no had no currency. It bought her nothing. In fact, it often cost her dearly. She learned early that a compliant object was treated with less casual cruelty than a defiant one. Silence was safer. Anticipating what was wanted and providing it before it was taken was a survival strategy. She had been bartered for goods that held more tangible worth in the eyes of the men who owned her. Once, she was the price for 2 Colt Patterson revolvers, their wooden grips worn smooth and their barrels tarnished. She had watched the exchange, standing barefoot on the splintered porch of a trading post. As the 2 men shook hands over the deal, she had looked at the guns, then at herself, and understood her place in the world. She was worth less than a matched pair of pistols. She was worth precisely 2 old guns. The most indelible proof of her status was not a memory, but a mark, a scar seared into the skin just above her hip. It was a Croix de C for Carrington, the brand of the mining operation that had been her last stop. They branded their mules and their property with the same hot iron. The day they had done it, the smell of her own burning flesh had filled her nostrils, a sickeningly sweet odor of ruin. The pain had been white-hot and absolute, but the true wound was the one left behind after the flesh had healed. It was a permanent declaration that she was not her own. She was livestock. She was a thing. So when she spoke of intimacy, of connection between a man and a woman, she did not know the language of desire or affection. She knew only the language of the marketplace. She knew how to haggle, how to present the goods in the best light, how to assess what a buyer was willing to pay. Her desperate question to the silent cowboy, "Do you want a virgin?" was not a seduction. It was a negotiation. It was her opening offer, the highest value commodity she believed she possessed. In her mind, she was laying her best card on the table, trying to secure a price that would guarantee her survival for another night. The man's response had shattered her reality. "I want your yes," he had said, "and only that." The words were simple, yet they were spoken in a dialect she could not comprehend. He had dismissed her currency, rendered her entire system of valuation meaningless. It was as if she had offered a king a handful of pebbles, and he had told her he was only interested in the air she breathed. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion. He was taller than she'd realized, broad-shouldered and lean, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in hard country. He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a water skin. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he walked over, his steps heavy but sure on the rocky ground, and knelt in front of her. The brim of his hat still hid his face, but she could feel his presence, solid and unwavering. He uncorked the skin and held it to her lips. For a moment, she flinched, expecting a trick, a sudden act of violence, but his hand was steady. Her thirst was a raging fire in her throat. And she gave in, drinking greedily. The cool water a shock to her system. It spilled down her chin, tracing clean paths through the grime on her neck. He let her drink until she coughed, pulling the skin away gently. Then he stood, and for the first time, he looked at her. He pushed the hat back on his head, and in the faint, silvery light of the rising moon, she saw his face. It was a landscape of its own, weathered and creased by sun and wind. His eyes were a pale, startling blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held no lust, no pity, not even curiosity. They just watched. He looked at her not like a man looks at an object to be appraised, but like he was looking at a spooked animal, trying to gauge if it would bolt or bite. "The name's Caleb Hawke," he said, his voice still that low, quiet rumble. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't ask her name. He just stated his own, a simple fact laid between them. Clara said nothing. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. This was not according to any script she knew. Men like him, men who lived and breathed the harshness of this land, were direct. They took what they wanted or they bargained for it. They didn't offer water to a runaway girl and speak in riddles about her yes. Caleb Hawke seemed to require no answer from her. He turned and walked back to his horse, moving with that same unhurried purpose. He unstrapped a bedroll from behind his saddle and tossed it onto the ground near a cluster of rocks. "You can sleep there. No one will bother you." He didn't touch her. He didn't come near her again. He took a jerky stick from his saddlebag and began to chew on it slowly, his back to her, looking out over the pilgrims' camp as if he were on watch. He had not bought her. He had not sold her. He had not laid a single finger on her. He had simply acknowledged her. And in doing so, he had thrown her entire world off its axis. She lay down on the rough wool of the bedroll, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her mind was wide awake. She watched his silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Caleb Hawke. The name meant nothing to her, but the man was an enigma. He was a walking contradiction to every lesson life had taught her. She had been raised in a world where everything had a price tag, where a person's worth could be measured in coins, guns, or acres of land. She had learned to see herself through those eyes, to calculate her own diminishing value with each passing year, each new owner. But Caleb Hawke had not looked at the goods. He had looked at her, and he had asked for something she wasn't even sure she owned a choice. Her yes. What did that even mean? A yes to what? A yes to him. A yes to a life she couldn't possibly imagine. The question was terrifying because it implied she had the power to say no, and power was something Clara had never, ever had. Sleep finally came, a shallow, dream-haunted thing. She dreamt of running, of the brand on her hip glowing like a hot coal, of men's faces leaning over her, their voices bartering in a language of numbers and weights. She awoke with a gasp to the pre-dawn chill, her heart hammering. The first thing she saw was Caleb Hawke, sitting in the exact same spot, a rifle resting across his lap. He hadn't slept. He had stood guard over her all night. He saw that she was awake but said nothing. He simply stood, stretched his stiff limbs, and began to saddle his horse. The pilgrims were already stirring, their quiet morning rituals beginning. Clara knew she had a choice. She could try to melt into their group and beg for mercy and food, and hope they didn't ask too many questions. Or she could face the man who had offered her water and a bedroll and spoken a language she didn't understand. Her pursuers were still out there. The pilgrims would eventually move on. She was alone and weak. Caleb Hawke was an unknown, but he was a powerful unknown, and he hadn't hurt her. When his horse was ready, he turned to her. He didn't command her or invite her. He simply looked at her, his pale eyes asking a silent question. It was the same question from the night before, distilled into a single, patient gaze. Clara pushed herself to her feet, her whole body an orchestra of pain. She looked from the relative safety of the pilgrim camp back to the solitary, imposing figure of Caleb Hawke. One was a world of rules and judgments she understood, a world that would likely cast her out. The other was a complete mystery. She thought of the branding iron, of the 2 old guns, of the suffocating feeling of being owned. Then she thought of his words. "I want your yes, and only that." Slowly, painfully, she took a step toward him, and then another. She didn't know what she was saying yes to, but for the first time in her life, she felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of a choice that was entirely her own. She was walking toward the man who had not bought her, had not sold her, and had not touched her, and she was terrified. They traveled for 2 days, moving north and west, away from the well-worn trails of pilgrims and traders, and into a land that seemed to have been forgotten by God. The silence between them was a third presence, vast and unbroken. Caleb Hawke did not ask her name, nor where she had come from, nor what she was running from. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the heat of the sun and the chill of the night as a simple, unchangeable fact. He rode his great black horse, and he had Clara walk alongside. He set a slow, steady pace, one that her battered feet could just about manage. When he saw her stumble for the 3rd time as the afternoon sun reached its peak, he stopped without a word. He dismounted, and with a gesture that was neither gentle nor rough, but simply practical, he lifted her by the waist and set her sideways on the saddle in front of him. The contact was brief and impersonal, the action of a man loading a sack of flour. Yet, for Clara, the feeling of being lifted, of being weightless for a moment, was so foreign it made her dizzy. She sat stiffly, her back not daring to touch his chest, every muscle tensed for a threat that never came. He smelled of leather, dust, and something else, the clean, sharp scent of pine needles. They rode like that until dusk. When they finally arrived at his home, it was not a ranch, nor a homestead. It was a place that seemed to be holding its breath. Tucked into a shallow canyon, protected from the worst of the wind, stood a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and stone. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, a last bastion against the emptiness that surrounded it. Beside it was a small, lean-to stable that housed a single sway-backed mare, its coat the color of faded buckskin. A few yards from the cabin, a canvas tent was staked to the ground, its flaps tied open to the evening air. The whole place was a study in grim functionality. There was no garden, no porch swing, no sign of a woman's touch. There was only what was necessary to survive. Caleb slid off the horse and then lifted her down, setting her on her feet as impassively as he had picked her up. Her legs nearly buckled from the long ride, and she put a hand against the horse's warm flank to steady herself. He led the animals to the stable, unsaddled them, and gave them water from a deep stone trough. Clara remained where he had left her, a piece of driftwood washed up on a strange and desolate shore. She watched him move, taking in the deliberate, efficient way he worked. There were no wasted steps, no hesitations. He was a man perfectly in tune with his environment. When he was done with the horses, he walked to the cabin, pushing the heavy plank door open. He paused on the threshold and looked back at her. It wasn't an invitation, just an acknowledgement. She understood. She was to follow. The inside was as sparse as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace that was cold and black. A narrow cot with a thin mattress and a neatly folded blanket sat against one wall. A crude wooden table and 2 stools were in the center of the room. Shelves on the far wall held a few tins of food, a cast-iron skillet, and a small stack of books. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old leather. There was no clutter, no personal effects, save for a collection of maps tacked to the wall above the table. Clara stood just inside the door, her hands clasped in front of her, feeling like an intruder. This was his space, his life. She had no place in it. The silence stretched, and the familiar panic began to rise in her throat. She had to establish her purpose, her value. She had to make the transaction clear. "I can work," she said, her voice small and hoarse in the quiet room. Caleb was at the fireplace, laying kindling. He didn't look at her. "Work." "To pay you back," she clarified, the words rushing out. "For the water, for bringing me here. I can cook, I can clean, I can mend your clothes. Whatever you need, I can earn my keep." It was the only way she knew how to exist in a man's world. You provided a service. You made yourself useful. You paid your debts. He placed a log on the kindling and straightened up, finally turning to face her. His expression was unreadable in the dim light filtering through the single grimy window. He considered her words for a moment, his pale eyes seeming to look right through her, to the scarred and battered foundations of her soul. "You don't owe me," he said. The 4 words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were a negation of her entire existence. If she didn't owe him, then what was she doing here? People didn't give charity in this land. Charity was a weakness, a luxury that got you killed. Everything had a cost. If she wasn't here to work, to pay a debt, then there could only be one other reason. The reason she had assumed from the start. But his actions, his complete lack of interest in her body, contradicted that. Her mind reeled, trying to find a foothold in this new, terrifying reality. "But I have to," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't just take—" "You were thirsty. I had water," he stated, as if it were the simplest equation in the world. He turned back to the fireplace and struck a match. A small flame flickered to life, catching on the dry wood. "That's all it was." He offered no further explanation. He lit a lantern on the table, and the room was filled with a warm, golden light that pushed the shadows into the corners. The light made the place feel less like a fortress and more like a refuge. But for Clara, the lack of a clear transaction, of rules she understood, was more frightening than any darkness. He gestured to the table. "Sit." It was a command, but it lacked the usual harshness. It was the directive of a man used to being obeyed because what he said was logical. She sat, perching on the edge of a stool, her spine ramrod straight. He took a loaf of hard bread from a tin, cut 2 thick slices with a large knife, and opened a jar of dried meat. He placed a portion on a plate and pushed it across the table to her. He did the same for himself and began to eat, his movements slow and methodical. Clara stared at the food. It was more than she had eaten in days, but her stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. She forced herself to take a bite. The bread was dry and tasteless, but it was sustenance. It was life. They ate in silence. When they were finished, he took the plates to a wash basin in the corner. He did not ask her to help. The question of sleeping arrangements hung in the air, a thick and suffocating presence. There was only one bed. She knew what that usually meant. She braced herself, her hands gripping the edge of the stool. When he was done washing the plates, he walked to the cot and picked up the single folded blanket. He turned to her. "The cot is yours," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll be in the tent." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. "No," she whispered. "That's your bed. I can sleep on the floor or in the stable. It doesn't matter." The stable was better than what she was used to. He shook his head, a small, decisive movement. "I don't sleep indoors much. You'll be safer in here. Bolt the door behind me." He walked out of the cabin, taking the blanket with him, and closed the heavy door, leaving her alone in the lantern light. She sat frozen on the stool for a long time, listening. She heard the soft thud of the door's outer bar being set in place. Then, nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the canyon. He had locked her in. Or had he locked everything else out? Slowly, she got up and walked to the door. She touched the thick wooden bolt on her side. With trembling fingers, she slid it into place. The sound of the heavy wood chunking into the iron bracket was deafeningly loud. She was locked in. She was safe. The two thoughts were so contradictory they made her head spin. She didn't immediately go to the cot. Instead, she was drawn to the maps on the wall. They were old, worn, and charted with a meticulous hand. They depicted vast, unnamed territories, mountains, and rivers she didn't recognize. But what held her attention were the symbols drawn in the margins and over certain landmarks. They weren't words or numbers. They were small, intricate drawings, some like a spiral, others like a stylized bird or a zigzagging line that resembled a snake or a bolt of lightning. She didn't know what they were, but they looked like the symbols she had seen on the painted hides and pottery of the Apache and Navajo traders who sometimes passed through the towns. Hours later, long after the lantern had burned low, she lay on the cot, still fully dressed, staring into the darkness. She couldn't sleep. The exhaustion had settled deep in her bones, but her mind was a frantic hive of activity. Through the single window, she could see the faint flicker of a small fire outside. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed for her own safety, got the better of her. She crept to the window and peered out. In the dancing firelight, she could see Caleb. He was sitting on a log near the entrance to his tent, his back to the cabin. He was not sleeping. He was working. A large piece of leather was spread across his lap, and with a set of fine tools, he was tooling an intricate pattern into its surface. His hands, which she knew were strong enough to lift her with ease, moved with a surprising delicacy and precision. He was completely absorbed in his work, a study in focused intensity. She watched him for what felt like an hour. When he finished with the leather, he carefully put his tools away. Then he drew his knife from the sheath on his belt. It was a long, formidable blade, and in the firelight, it looked deadly. But he didn't look at it as a weapon. He produced a whetstone and began to sharpen the blade. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a soft, hypnotic sound in the vast silence of the night. He sharpened it with a practiced, almost loving care, as if it were an extension of his own hand. Finally, he put the knife away. He unrolled one of the maps from his saddlebag and spread it on the ground. With a piece of charcoal, he began to draw again, adding those strange, cryptic symbols to the paper. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his head bent low over his work. He was a man of profound silences and secret occupations. He was a protector who asked for nothing, a warrior who drew pictures in the dark. Clara backed away from the window and returned to the cot. She lay down, her body still tense, but some of the fear had been replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. He had told her she owed him nothing. He had given her food, shelter, and a bolted door. He asked no questions. He made no demands. In the dim light of his cabin, surrounded by his silent possessions and the evidence of his secret knowledge, Clara realized that for the first time in her life, she was not a piece of property. She was something else. She just didn't know what, and that was the most terrifying and hopeful feeling she had ever known. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Clara woke on the cot in the cabin, and Caleb would already be gone from his tent, tending to the horses or disappearing into the pre-dawn hills, returning with a rabbit or two slung over his shoulder. He never told her what to do, yet she found herself doing it. She swept the packed earth floor, washed their 2 plates and single skillet, and refilled the water bucket from the well. These were the actions of her past life, the chores of a servant. But here, under the vast, silent sky, they felt different. No one watched her with a critical eye. No one timed her work. The tasks were simply there, a part of the day's existence, and doing them was a way to fill the terrifying emptiness of her newfound freedom. She learned to read his silences. A slight nod of his head toward the woodpile meant it needed splitting. A glance at the nearly empty water barrel was a command more potent than any shouted orders she had ever received. He taught her without teaching, showing her how to distinguish dry, burnable wood from green, and how to properly stack it to keep it from the damp. He never touched her, never guided her hands, but would simply do a task correctly in her line of sight. And she, a student of survival, would watch and learn. One morning, About a week after her arrival, he did something different. After their silent meal of dried meat and hardtack, he walked to the corner of the cabin where a long rifle rested against the wall. He picked it up, checked its mechanism with a practiced motion, and then looked at her. He held it out. Clara froze. The only time she had seen guns used was in anger, as tools of coercion or punishment. They were things to be feared, objects that sealed bargains and ended lives. "I don't know how," she whispered, her hands remaining at her sides. "I know," Caleb said. It was not a judgment, just a statement of fact. "But you'll learn. You can't live in this country and be helpless." He didn't force it on her. He simply held it, waiting. Her fear of the weapon was immense, but her fear of being helpless was greater. Slowly, as if approaching a coiled snake, she reached out and took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, the wood of the stock smooth and cool, the metal of the barrel radiating a sense of cold purpose. He led her out of the cabin and into the hills. He didn't speak for the first hour, letting her grow accustomed to the weight of the rifle in her arms and the rhythm of walking on the uneven ground. He moved through the landscape with a grace that was almost supernatural, his feet making barely a sound. She, in contrast, felt clumsy and loud, her every step snapping a twig or dislodging a stone. He finally stopped, raising a hand. He pointed to a small, flat rock about 50 yards away. "That's your target," he said. He showed her how to load the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. His instructions were sparse, boiled down to their essential components. Squeeze, don't pull. Let the shot surprise you. Clara did as she was told. She lifted the heavy weapon, the stock pressing awkwardly into the soft flesh of her shoulder. She closed one eye, squinting, trying to align the sights. The rock seemed to dance in her vision. She held her breath, her heart hammering, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical shock, a violent roar that slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder and filled the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The recoil sent her stumbling back a step. The rock was untouched. A cloud of dust kicked up a good 10 feet to the left of it. A hot flush of shame washed over her. She expected a curse, a blow, a sharp word about the wasted powder and lead. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder throbbing, and waited for the inevitable anger. Caleb merely walked over and took the rifle from her. "You flinched," he said, his voice even. "Everyone does the first time. You breathe out halfway, hold it, then squeeze. Try again." There was no anger, no impatience, just a calm correction. She took the rifle, reloaded under his watchful eye, and tried again, and again, and again. By the time the sun was high in the sky, her shoulder was a tender, bruised mess. But she had managed to chip a piece off the edge of the rock. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The next day, he woke her before dawn. "We're going hunting," he announced. This time, the purpose of the rifle felt different. It wasn't a tool for learning. It was a tool for killing. The thought settled like a cold stone in her stomach. They walked for miles, deeper into the canyons than she had ever been. The land was raw and beautiful, a place of stark contrasts where life clung stubbornly to the cracks in the rock. Caleb moved like a ghost, reading the signs of the land, a bent twig, a fresh track in the dust, the nervous chatter of a bird with an intensity that fascinated her. Late in the afternoon, he froze, holding up his hand for silence. He sank into a crouch, and she clumsily followed his lead. He pointed through a thicket of mesquite. There, in a small clearing, was a doe. It was grazing peacefully, its coat the color of honey in the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful, elegant, and heartbreakingly alive. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Caleb slowly raised his rifle, the movement so fluid it seemed a part of the wind. He took aim. Clara watched, her stomach churning. She knew this was necessary. This was meat for the winter. This was survival. But Caleb didn't shoot. He held his aim for a long, silent moment. Clara could see the doe's side, the gentle swell of its belly. It was carrying a fawn. The creature lifted its head, its large, dark eyes scanning the landscape, its ears twitching. It had not seen them. Slowly, deliberately. Caleb lowered his rifle. He watched the doe for another minute before it ambled gracefully back into the trees and disappeared. Clara stared at him, bewildered. They were low on meat. They had spent the entire day tracking. This was a perfect, easy shot. Her entire life had been governed by the principle of taking what you could, when you could, because the opportunity might never come again. To let such a prize walk away was incomprehensible. It was a weakness. She had to ask, "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb turned his pale eyes on her. He looked not at the spot where the deer had been, but at her, as if weighing her capacity to understand. "If we take life," he said, his voice low and serious, "we owe it a purpose. Her purpose right now is to bring another life into this world. Ours is just to fill our bellies. Her purpose is greater." The words settled over her. Simple and profound. He had not seen a walking meal. He had seen a mother. He had weighed one life against another and found his own wanting. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of the wilderness, Caleb Hawke had factored in a variable she had never known existed on her. They did not go home empty-handed. Caleb changed their direction, leading them higher into the rocky crags of the mountains. The air grew thinner and cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. He was heading for a specific place, tucked away in a fold of the mountain. Almost invisible until you were upon it, was a small hovel made of stone and sod, a thin curl of smoke rising from a hole in its roof. An old woman sat outside, her back to a sun-warmed rock, her hands busy weaving a basket from yucca fibers. Her face was a testament to time, a map of wrinkles so deep they seemed carved from the rock itself. Her skin was dark and leathery, her eyes black and bright as a bird's. She looked up as they approached, her gaze passing over Clara without interest before settling on Caleb. A slow smile cracked her wrinkled face. "Ah," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The abandoned child of two lands returns. You are hungry. I feel it. The mountain was not generous today." Caleb gave a slight nod. "Nakai." The name was Navajo. Clara thought, the woman. Nakai looked him up and down. "You have a shadow now," she observed, her sharp eyes finally flicking back to Clara. "This one is broken, but not rotten, not yet." Clara flinched at the assessment, but there was no malice in the old woman's voice, only a statement of fact, as if she were commenting on the quality of a clay pot. Caleb ignored the comment. "We need herbs for fever, and the mare needs better fodder than we have." Without another word, Nakai disappeared into her hovel. She returned with a small leather pouch that smelled of mint and bitter roots, and pointed to a stack of dried, sweet-smelling grass. "Take what you need. The mountain provides." Caleb bundled up a large armful of the hay and tied it with a rope. He left 2 rabbits on her doorstep. It was another transaction, but one with outspoken terms. A silent exchange based on an understanding that ran deeper than words. As they turned to leave, Nakai called out to Caleb, "Be careful, child. The wind carries the scent of iron and greed from the south. They look for what they have lost." Caleb didn't respond, but Clara saw his shoulders tense slightly. He knew. He had known all along. The walk back was silent, the old woman's words hanging between them. When they finally reached the cabin, darkness had fallen. Clara felt a weariness that was more than just physical. She had seen a man spare a life out of principle, and she had heard him called a name that hinted at a life of deep and painful complexity. The abandoned child of 2 lands. It echoed in her mind, a key to a door she had no idea how to open. That night, while Caleb tended to the horses, Clara found herself standing before the fireplace. There was a small pot, and on the shelf were the last of the dried vegetables and the jerky they had been eating. An idea took hold of her, a foolish, terrifying impulse. She would cook. She would make a stew. It was a way to repay him for the day, for the lesson, for the safety he provided. It was a way to feel useful. Her hands trembled as she prepared the food. Every step was fraught with the memory of past punishments. She could hear the saloon owner's voice in her head, cursing her for adding too much water. She could feel the sting of the back of the fur trader's hand for letting the fire get too high and scorching the bottom of the pot. She chopped the vegetables into small, uneven pieces, her knife skills clumsy. She added the jerky and covered it with water, her heart pounding with a familiar dread. She let it simmer over the fire, stirring it with a wooden spoon, watching it with an anxiety so intense it made her feel sick. It smelled okay, but she had left it on for too long while she was lost in thought. The vegetables were probably too soft, the meat tougher than it should be. It was overcooked. It was ruined. When Caleb came in, the smell of the stew filled the small cabin. He stopped, his eyes going from the pot to her. Clara braced herself, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, waiting for the inevitable critique, the dismissal, the anger at her waste of precious food. He said nothing. He simply took a bowl from the shelf, ladled a helping of the stew for himself, and sat down at the table. Clara remained by the fire, unable to move, barely able to breathe. She watched as he lifted the first spoonful to his lips. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. He looked into the bowl, then took another bite, and another. He ate the entire bowl without saying a word, without once looking at her. When he was finished, he stood up, took his bowl to the wash basin, and began to clean it. He hadn't praised it. He hadn't said it was good, but he hadn't cursed her. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't thrown the bowl against the wall. He had simply eaten the stew she had made, her imperfect, overcooked offering. In the crushing silence of the small cabin, the absence of cruelty was the kindest thing she had ever known. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. For the first time since she could remember, she had made a mistake, and the world had not ended. The peace in the canyon was a fragile thing, as thin and delicate as a spider's web. In the weeks she had been with Caleb, Clara had begun to feel its threads settling over her, quieting the constant, frantic terror that had been the soundtrack to her life. The quiet was no longer just an absence of noise, but a presence in itself. It was in the hum of insects in the midday heat, the whisper of the wind through the sparse pines, and the steady, rhythmic sound of Caleb working with his leather and tools. She had stopped flinching at every shadow, and the nightmares, while still present, came less frequently. She was outside, mending one of Caleb's rough spun shirts with a needle and thread she had found in a small wooden box. When she first saw them, they were a smudge of dust on the far horizon, a disturbance in the clear blue stillness of the sky. At first, she thought nothing of it, a dust devil, perhaps, or a stray gust of wind. But the smudge grew, darkened, and slowly resolved itself into three distinct shapes, riders. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. It was an old instinct, a primal recognition of the predator. Her hands stopped moving, the needle frozen in the fabric. Her heart began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drum signaling an alarm she had prayed she would never hear again. Caleb was by the stable, sharpening the blade of a small hand axe on a whetstone. He worked with his usual focused calm, seemingly oblivious to the approaching threat. She wanted to call out to him, to warn him, but the fear had stolen her voice, her throat closing up tight. She could only watch, paralyzed, as the three horsemen drew closer, their figures becoming clearer with each passing second. She recognized the lead rider first. His name was Silas, a cruel, wiry man with a rat-like face and small, dark eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. He had been one of Carrington's chief enforcers at the mining camp, a man who seemed to derive a deep and genuine pleasure from the suffering of others. The other two were his cronies, brutish men named Abe and Finn, whose only loyalty was to the promise of coin and violence. They had found her, the fragile piece of the canyon shattered into a million pieces. This place, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, was now just a trap. By the time the riders were 100 yards away, Caleb had stopped his work. He didn't look up, but Clara saw his entire body go still. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone ceased. He laid the axe down gently, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stood to his full height. He turned, not toward the riders, but toward the cabin, his pale eyes finding hers. In that single look, he seemed to absorb the entirety of her terror. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a command, stay put. The three men reined in their horses about 20 feet from the cabin, their mounts stamping and snorting, kicking up clouds of dust. The air grew thick with a palpable menace. Silas's eyes scanned the small homestead with a contemptuous sneer, taking in the humble cabin, the old mare, the canvas tent. Then his gaze landed on Clara, and his thin lips twisted into a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling sense of ownership. "Well, well," Silas drawled, his voice a greasy caress that made Clara's skin crawl. "Look what the wind blew in. Got tired of running. Did you, girl?" Clara couldn't speak. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. All the progress she had made, all the tiny steps she had taken toward feeling like a person, evaporated in the heat of his gaze. She was a thing again. His thing. Caleb moved then. He walked with that same unhurried, deliberate pace, positioning himself directly between Clara and the three men. He did not go for his gun. He did not say a word. He simply stood there, blocking the entrance to the cabin, his broad shoulders creating a solid wall of defiance. Silas's gaze shifted to Caleb, his eyes narrowing as he took in the tall, silent man. He sized Caleb up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and professional appraisal. "This your new protector?" Silas sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He don't look like much. Step aside. Friend, we ain't got business with you. We're just here to collect what's ours." Caleb remained silent, his face as impassive as the rock of the canyon walls. His stillness was more unnerving than any threat. It was a complete and utter refusal to acknowledge their power, their right to be there. Abe, the largest of the three men, shifted impatiently in his saddle. "You hear him. Mr. The girl belongs to the Carrington camp. Mr. Carrington paid good money for her." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. Belongs to? Paid good money? The language of the ledger, of the brand, of the auction block. It was the only language these men knew. And they were using it to erase her, to turn her back into a possession right before Caleb's eyes. Silas's patience, always a thin commodity, was clearly wearing out. "Look, I don't know who you are, and I don't care. That girl is property. She ran off, and we're taking her back. You can either step aside and live to see the sunset, or you can die here in the dirt over something that ain't even yours." Caleb's voice, when it finally came, was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. "She ain't property." The simple statement, delivered without heat or bluster, seemed to enrage Silas more than any curse would have. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "She ain't, boy. Everything in this world is property, and she belongs to a man who don't take kindly to thieves." He leaned forward in his saddle, his hand drifting down to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "This is your last chance. Move." Caleb didn't move. He just watched them, his pale eyes cold and steady. Clara could see the muscles in his jaw clench, the only outward sign of the tension coiling within him. It happened in a heartbeat. The world seemed to slow down, every detail becoming unnaturally sharp. She saw Silas's hand tighten on his gun, She saw Finn's hand twitch toward his own belt. They were going to kill him. They were going to kill the one person who had ever looked at her and seen something more than an object to be used. The man who had given her water, a bed, and a choice. In that split second, something inside Clara snapped. It was not a thought. It was not a plan. It was a pure, primal instinct, a desperate, hopeless act of preservation. He had stood in front of her. He had been her shield. She launched herself forward, out from behind the shelter of his body, and stood directly in front of him, her arms spread wide. "No!" The word was torn from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of defiance. The action was so unexpected it startled everyone, including Caleb. For a split second, the tableau was frozen, the three menacing riders, the silent man behind her, and the small, defiant girl standing between them, a human shield against a wall of violence. Silas's face contorted in a mask of fury and disbelief. "Get out of the way, you stupid!" His hand, already in motion, completed its task. He drew his pistol from its holster. In the same chaotic moment, Finn, spooked by her sudden movement, fumbled for his own weapon. There was a deafening crack as a gun went off. A searing, white-hot pain tore through Clara's left shoulder. It was like being struck by lightning. The force of the impact spun her around, and she collapsed. Not forward, but back against Caleb. She felt his arms go around her, steadying her, breaking her fall. The world tilted, the blue sky and the brown earth switching places. And then she witnessed what Caleb Hawke became when he was pushed past the point of no return. The man who had held her was gone. In his place was something else, something elemental and terrifyingly swift. As Clara sagged against him, his right hand moved. It was not a blur. It was faster than that. It was an act of pure, lethal instinct. His pistol seemed to materialize in his hand, already cocked, already aimed. There were two shots, so close together they sounded like a single, ripping tear in the fabric of the world. They were not loud and booming like the first shot had been. They were flat, concise, and utterly final. Finn, whose gun had fired and struck her, was thrown from his saddle as if hit by an invisible fist, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Silas, his own gun only halfway raised, stared with wide, shocked eyes, his mouth open to speak a word that would never be uttered. A small, neat hole appeared in the center of his forehead, and he slumped forward, falling from his horse like a sack of grain. Abe, the third man, stared in dumb horror, his hand frozen halfway to his weapon. He looked from his fallen comrades to the still, smoking pistol in Caleb's hand. He looked at Caleb's face, and what he saw there made him cry out, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He yanked on his horse's reins, turning the panicked animal so violently it nearly fell. He spurred it mercilessly, galloping back the way he had come, a desperate, fleeing coward. Caleb didn't shoot him. He let him go, his attention already elsewhere. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the frantic panting of the two remaining riderless horses and the soft moan that escaped Clara's lips. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. The world swam back into focus for Clara. The sharp, agonizing pain in her shoulder was a brutal anchor to reality. She was on the ground, cradled against Caleb's chest. He was kneeling over her, his pistol already holstered, his hands moving over her shoulder with a desperate urgency. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with a feeling she couldn't name. It was the first time he had ever used her name. She looked up at his face. The cold, deadly killer from a moment before was gone, but the calm, impassive man she knew had not returned. In his place was someone else, his features etched with a raw, fierce concern. His pale eyes, usually so distant, were fixed on her, and in their depths. She saw a storm of emotions she had never expected to see. He looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as something precious that had been broken. "It hurts," she whispered, the shock giving way to waves of nauseating pain. "I know," he said, his voice tight. "I know, just hold on." He ripped a piece of fabric from her dress and pressed it hard against the wound. The world began to gray at the edges, the sounds of the canyon fading into a distant roar. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Caleb Hawke's face, a landscape of terrible and beautiful contradictions. A man who would spare a doe but would not hesitate to kill for what was his to protect. The world came back to her in jagged, pain-filled fragments. The first thing she registered was the movement. She was being lifted, her body a dead weight, her wounded shoulders screaming in protest. A strong arm was around her back, another under her knees. She was pressed against a chest as solid as an oak tree, the rough fabric of a shirt scratching her cheek. She smelled dust, gunpowder, and the faint, coppery scent of her own blood. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the chest she was against, a sound of immense effort and raw urgency. It was Caleb. He carried her into the cabin as if she weighed nothing, his long strides covering the distance in a few heartbeats. He laid her gently on the narrow cot, the sudden stillness as jarring as the motion had been. The room spun, the log walls and the stone fireplace blurring into a swirl of brown and gray. A wave of nausea washed over her, and the darkness at the edge of her vision threatened to swallow her whole. Through the haze of pain, she saw him move with a terrifying efficiency. He was no longer the quiet man who worked leather or sharpened knives in the firelight. He was a field surgeon in a war of one. He stoked the fire until it roared, setting a pot of water to boil. He tore strips from a clean shirt he took from a small chest, his movements quick and precise. He brought the lantern closer to the cot, its yellow light washing over her, exposing her vulnerability. She tried to speak, to tell him to stop, to leave her, but only a weak, breathy sound escaped her lips. He placed a hand on her uninjured shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. "Stay still, Clara," he said, his voice low and taut. It was the second time he had said her name, and it sounded both foreign and intimate in the tense silence of the room. He took his knife from its sheath. Her eyes widened in fear, a fresh surge of adrenaline cutting through the pain. He saw her terror, and for a fraction of a second, his expression softened. "The bullet has to come out," he explained, his voice losing none of its urgency but taking on a softer edge. "It will poison you if it stays." He held the blade in the roaring flames of the fireplace until the tip glowed a dull red, then plunged it into the pot of boiling water. The next hour was a blur of agony. He gave her a thick strip of leather to bite down on, and she bit into it with all her strength as he worked. The pain was a living thing, a white-hot serpent coiling and uncoiling in her shoulder. She felt the probe of the knife, the hideous scrape of steel against bone, and she screamed into the leather, the sound a muffled, animal cry of pure torment. She was vaguely aware of Caleb murmuring to her, not words of comfort, but short, guttural commands. "Breathe." "Almost there." "Hold on." They were the words of a man fighting a battle, his focus absolute. Then, a final, excruciating twist, and she heard a small clink as something metallic dropped into a tin bowl. The worst of it was over. He worked quickly then, cleaning the wound with whiskey that burned like a second fire, packing it with a poultice of the herbs the old woman, Nakai, had given him. The bitter, medicinal smell filled her nostrils. He bandaged it tightly with the clean strips of cloth, his hands surprisingly gentle now that the brutal part of his work was done. When he finished, she was limp and drenched in a cold sweat, the leather strip fallen from her slack jaw. He covered her with a thick wool blanket, and she fell into a darkness that was deeper and more complete than sleep. She awoke to a world of heat and confusion. The fire was banked low, but a raging furnace burned inside her. The fever had taken hold. The cabin seemed to pulse with the frantic beating of her own heart. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, morphing into the leering faces of men from her past: the fur trader, the saloon owner, Silas. They whispered to her from the walls, their voices a venomous chorus. A cool, damp cloth was pressed to her forehead, a small island of relief in an ocean of fire. She blinked, her eyes struggling to focus. Caleb's face swam into view above her. He looked tired, his weathered features drawn and taut in the flickering light. He had not left her side. "Water," she croaked, her throat a desert of dust and ash. He held a tin cup to her lips, tilting it gently, and she drank. The cool liquid a temporary balm. The relief was short-lived. A violent chill racked her body, her teeth chattering uncontrollably despite the fire burning within her. He piled another blanket on top of her, but the cold was deep in her bones, a frozen river flowing through her veins. The night became a timeless, terrifying landscape of waking nightmares. She was no longer in the cabin. She was back at the Carrington camp, the brand on her hip searing with fresh pain. She was on an auction block, men with cold, appraising eyes inspecting her like livestock. She was a bargaining chip in a card game, her value rising and falling with the turn of a card. Through it all, Caleb was a constant, steady presence. He moved back and forth from the fireplace to her cot, his silent vigil a single point of sanity in her fractured world. He kept the fire going. He boiled water, changing the cloths on her forehead whenever they grew warm from her fever. He did not sleep. He did not rest. He simply watched, and he waited. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the fever was at its peak, he tried to feed her. He had attempted to make a kind of porridge, a thin, watery gruel of cornmeal and water. He knelt beside her and held a spoonful to her lips. It was a clumsy, awkward gesture for a man whose hands were so capable with a knife or a rifle. The porridge was lumpy and tasteless, but the effort behind it was a thing of profound and startling tenderness. She managed a few swallows before turning her head away, a fresh wave of delirium pulling her under. The ghosts of her past grew louder, their whispers turning into demands. The core of her terror, the foundation upon which her entire life had been built, broke through the fever's haze. The words spilled from her lips, a broken, desperate litany. "Don't trade me," she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred. She thrashed against the blankets, her hands clutching at the rough wool. "Please, don't trade me." Caleb, who was wiping her face with a damp cloth, went still. He listened, his expression unreadable. Her pleas grew more frantic, more lucid. She was no longer just mumbling. She was begging. "I'll be good. I'll work. Worth more than 2 guns. Please don't trade me again." Each word was a glimpse into a past he had never asked about but had clearly understood. Each phrase was a testament to the horrors she had endured. He had seen the brand on her hip when he had treated her wound, the ugly, puckered C that marked her as someone's property. He had seen it, and his jaw had tightened into a line as hard as granite. She began to weep, hot tears tracking paths through the sweat and grime on her face. Her voice was the raw, hopeless sound of a soul that had been broken on the anvil of the world. "Please, what's the price I'll pay? Just don't trade me." Caleb set the cloth aside. He leaned closer, his large frame shielding her from the flickering shadows. He waited until her frantic sobs subsided into a low, continuous whimper. The cabin was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the sound of her ragged, desperate breaths. He lowered his head until his lips were close to her ear. His voice, when he spoke, was not a command, not a reassurance, but a quiet, solemn vow spoken into the heart of her nightmare. It was a truth so fundamental, so opposite to everything she had ever been taught, that it felt like a prayer. "No one owns you," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against the storm of her fever. "Not even me." The words, spoken so softly, cut through the delirium. They sliced through the ghostly voices of the men who had bought and sold her. They were a shield against the memories of the auction block and the branding iron. In the chaotic, fiery landscape of her fevered mind, the words did not make sense, but she felt them. She felt their weight, their shape, their profound and unwavering certainty. They did not banish the ghosts, but they dimmed their power. They did not quench the fever, but they offered a single, cool drop of water in the midst of the flames. Clara's frantic movements ceased, her whimpering quieted. Her body, still burning with fever, relaxed slightly into the mattress. She was still lost, still trapped in the long, dark night of her sickness. But a small, steady light had just been lit. The words echoed in the deepest part of her being, a tiny, defiant ember glowing in the face of a lifetime of darkness. No one owns you, not even me, and for the first time, in the depths of her brokenness, she began to believe it might be true. The fever broke like a thunderstorm. One moment, Clara was lost in a turbulent sea of heat and phantom whispers. The next, she was washed ashore in the calm, gray light of dawn, her skin clammy with sweat, her mind clear for the first time in days. The fire inside her was gone, leaving behind a profound and aching weakness. She felt hollowed out, as if the fever had burned away not just the sickness, but parts of her old self, leaving a fragile, uncertain emptiness in their place. Her recovery was a slow, quiet affair. The days melted into one another, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun through the cabin's single window. Caleb continued his silent, steadfast care. He brought her water and thin, lumpy porridge, which she now ate with a quiet gratitude. He would leave for hours at a time, and she would hear the distant report of his rifle or the thud of his axe splitting wood. He always returned, a silent guardian checking on his charge. He never mentioned the night of the attack. He never spoke of the two bodies he had dragged into the hills and buried under nameless piles of rock. He never spoke of the words she had cried out in her delirium. The violence and the vulnerability of that long night were sealed away in the vast, unspoken space between them. As her strength returned, Clara was able to sit up on the cot, and then to take a few shaky steps around the cabin. During these moments, she watched him. She watched him repair a saddle, his large hands moving with an artisan's grace. She watched him clean his rifle, his focus absolute. She watched him stand at the cabin door for long stretches, staring out at the vast, empty land as if listening for something only he could hear. His words from the fever dream echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. No one owns you, not even me. The phrase had taken root in the scorched earth of her soul, a single, tenacious seed of a foreign idea. She tested it in her thoughts, turning it over and over. If no one owned her, what was she? She was not his property, not his servant, not his prisoner. She was a guest, a stray he had taken in. The lack of a clear definition was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their quiet days. Her past had been a series of transactions, her value clearly defined, her purpose simple. Now, there was no transaction. She felt a profound, crushing weight of debt, but he refused to let her pay it in the only currency she knew, servitude. When she tried to sweep the floor, he would gently take the broom from her hands and point her back to the cot. "You need to heal," was all he would say. The wound in her shoulder began to mend, the sharp, searing pain dulling to a persistent, heavy ache. It was a constant reminder of the moment she had stood in front of him, a willing shield. It was the first truly defiant act of her life, the first choice she had made that was not about her own survival, but about someone else's. And it had nearly killed her. The scar, she knew, would be a part of her forever, a physical mark of her break with the past. But the deeper wounds, the ones that didn't bleed, were harder to heal. As her body grew stronger, her mind grew more troubled. She was living in a state of grace she didn't understand and felt she hadn't earned. And a single, terrifying question began to consume her. In her old life, her value had been predicated on a single, brutal fact, a detail men like Carrington paid a premium for. It was the thing she had tried to barter with in the desert, her last, most valuable coin. Caleb had cared for her, protected her, killed for her. He had seen her at her most broken, heard her most shameful secrets cried out in a fever, But she had to know if, in the end, his quiet kindness was based on the same flawed premise as every other man's interest. She had to know if he wanted her because he believed she was something she was not. The question festered for days, a poison in the fragile peace of her recovery. She would form the words in her mind, only to have them die on her lips, her courage failing her. The moment finally came one evening. The wind was howling outside, a lonely, mournful sound that made the small cabin feel like the only bastion of warmth and light in the world. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb was sitting at the table, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shing, 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 a familiar, comforting sound. Clara was on her stool, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulder aching with a dull throb. She watched the firelight play across his weathered face, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was a landscape of contradictions, a man of brutal violence and profound gentleness. She had to know. She had to lance the wound of her own uncertainty. "Caleb." Her voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the wind and the steel. He stopped his work, the silence suddenly immense. He looked at her, his pale eyes questioning. She swallowed, her throat dry. "That first night, in the desert," she began, her voice trembling. "What I asked you—" He waited, his gaze steady and patient. He was not going to help her. This was a path she had to walk on her own. She took a shaky breath. The words came out in a rush, a torrent of shame and fear. "Would you still want me if I'm not untouched?" The question hung between them, as raw and vulnerable as the wound in her shoulder. It was the sum of all her fears, the distillation of a lifetime of being valued for a single, fragile part of herself. She braced for his answer, expecting a flicker of disappointment, a change in his eyes, the subtle but unmistakable withdrawal of his kindness. Caleb did not answer right away. He set the knife and the whetstone down on the table with deliberate care. He leaned back on his stool, his chair creaking in protest, and he just looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were seeing not just her face, but every scar, every brand, every invisible wound she carried. There was no judgment in his eyes, no anger, no pity. There was only a deep, profound stillness, a weighing and a measuring of things far more important than her question. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a revelation. He did not answer her. Instead, he asked a question of his own, a question that struck at the very root of her pain. "You think you're only worth what's unused?" The words hit her with a physical force. He wasn't asking about her body. He was asking about her soul. He was holding up a mirror to the twisted, broken way she saw herself, forcing her to look at its ugliness. Before she could even begin to process it, he pushed his stool back and stood up. He walked to the shelf where they kept their few dishes. His movements were slow, deliberate. He reached past the 2 whole tin cups and took a third one from the back, a simple ceramic mug. He brought it back to the table and set it down in the pool of lantern light between them. It was flawed. A noticeable chip was missing from the rim, and a thin, dark crack ran down its side like a scar. It was an object that, in any other place, would have been thrown away. He tapped the chipped rim with his finger. "This one's chipped," he said, his voice a low rumble. He then filled the cup with water from the bucket, and though a tiny trickle escaped from the crack, the cup held the water. He pushed it toward her. "Still holds water." He paused, his pale eyes locking with hers, and delivered the final, devastating truth. "Still mine." The word mine did not sound like the word Silas had used. It was not the brand of an owner, the claim of a master. It was the quiet, fierce declaration of a man who chose what he valued, a man who saw worth beyond perfection. It was a word of belonging, not of possession. Clara stared at the chipped cup, at the way it held the water despite its brokenness. A sob caught in her throat, thick and painful. Caleb sat back down, his gaze never leaving her face. He was not finished. He had dismantled her past. Now he was going to offer her a future. "I never asked what happened to your body," he said, his voice softening ever so slightly, but losing none of its power. "I'm asking what you want now." And there it was, the same question from the desert, the same impossible, terrifying offer of choice. He wasn't interested in her history. He was interested in her will. He wasn't claiming her virginity or her scars. He was asking for her yes. He was asking for the one thing no one had ever wanted, the one thing she was just now learning she possessed. She looked from the broken cup to the unbroken man in front of her, and for the first time, she had no answer. The question of what she wanted was so vast, so new, so utterly foreign, that it left her speechless. But in the quiet space where her fear had once lived, something new was beginning to grow. It was not yet hope, not yet love. It was something far more fundamental. It was possibility. Caleb's question, "What do you want now?" did not demand an immediate answer. It was a seed he had planted in the barren ground of her soul, and he seemed content to let it lie dormant, to wait for a rain that might never come. He did not press her. Instead, he began to teach her the language of this new life, a language spoken not with words, but with the hands, the back, and the will. Their world, once confined to the four walls of the cabin and the tense space between them, expanded. It pushed outward, claiming a small patch of the unforgiving land as its own. It began with the fence. One morning, Caleb drove the wagon to a sparse grove of juniper trees a few miles away and returned with a load of sturdy, straight posts. He showed Clara how to dig the post holes, how to measure the distance between them with her own stride, how to tamp the earth down until the post stood firm and true against the push of her full weight. The work was brutal. The ground was a stubborn mix of rock and sun-baked clay. Her hands, soft and unaccustomed to labor, were soon a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and eventually hardened into calluses. Her muscles screamed in protest, a fiery ache that settled deep in her back and shoulders. In her old life, such pain was a precursor to punishment, a sign she was failing. Here, it was different. When she looked at her raw, dirt-caked hands, she felt not shame, but a strange, unfamiliar flicker of pride. These were the hands of a builder, not a victim. Caleb worked beside her, his movements a symphony of contained power and efficiency. He never criticized her clumsy efforts. If she struggled to lift a post, he would simply appear at her side and take the heavier end without a word. If her shovel struck a rock she couldn't budge, he would use his iron pry bar to work it free. He taught her through demonstration, his patience a silent, steady force. He was showing her how to build a barrier, how to define a space that was theirs, a sanctuary protected not by a bolted door, but by their own shared labor. When the posts were set, he brought out a heavy roll of barbed wire. He taught her how to stretch it taut, how to handle the vicious barbs without tearing her flesh, how to staple it securely to the posts. As she worked, she thought of the brand on her hip. That was a mark of ownership, a fence someone else had built around her soul. This fence was different. This was a boundary she was helping to create, a line drawn in the dust that said, "Here, we will make a stand. Here, we will live." Once the fence was complete, enclosing a small square of land around the cabin and stable, Caleb brought out an old, single-blade plow. He hitched the old mare to it, the sway-backed horse surprisingly strong and steady. "The ground is hard," he said, one of his rare, direct instructions. "You have to keep the blade deep." He plowed the first row himself, the muscles in his back and arms cording as he wrestled the plow through the resistant earth. The blade cut a dark, moist line through the dry surface, turning up the rich, dark soil that lay sleeping beneath. It smelled of life, of damp stone and the promise of growing things. Then, he handed the reins and the handles to her. The plow was a living beast, bucking and kicking as it caught on rocks and roots. It was a constant battle of will and strength, pitting her small frame against the immense inertia of the land. More than once, it threw her to the side, and she lay in the dirt, gasping for breath, the taste of dust and failure in her mouth. Each time, Caleb would simply wait, his silence a challenge. He would not help her with this. This was a struggle she had to win on her own. And she did, gritting her teeth, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She learned the rhythm of it. She learned to anticipate the rocks, to use her weight to keep the blade true, to feel the subtle shifts in the soil through the vibrating wooden handles. By the end of the day, she had carved 3 crooked but complete furrows alongside his perfectly straight one. She stood, covered in sweat and dirt, looking at the turned earth, and felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it almost brought her to her knees. She had not just plowed a field, she had asserted her will upon the world, and it had, however grudgingly, yielded. Their next act was one of blind faith. The sky remained a vast, cloudless expanse of blue. The air was dry, and the seasonal rains were late. Any sensible person would have waited. But Caleb seemed to operate on a different kind of logic, one that was part faith, part defiance. He brought out small cloth sacks of seeds he had gotten from Nakai corn, beans, and squash. Together, they walked the furrows, planting the seeds in the soil she had helped turn. He showed her how to place the corn first, then the beans at its base so they could climb the stalks, and the squash in between, its broad leaves providing shade and holding moisture in the soil. They were planting a community, a system where each plant supported the others. Her fingers, pushing the small, hard seeds into the cool, dark earth, trembled slightly. It felt like a prayer. They were entrusting these tiny specks of potential life to a land that had given them no reason to hope. They were building a future on the assumption of a rain that might never fall. Every seed she planted felt like a silent answer to his question. What do you want? I want this. I want to see this grow. Life, and the need to protect it, arrived a week later in a wooden crate tied to the back of Caleb's horse. Chickens, 10 of them, clucking and scratching. A sudden, chaotic burst of domesticity in their stark, silent world. He built them a small coop against the stable wall, and suddenly, their homestead had a new rhythm, punctuated by the crowing of a rooster at dawn and the soft clucking of the hens. With the chickens came a new danger. "Coyotes," Caleb said one evening, gesturing to the hills that were turning purple in the twilight. "And sometimes wolves. They'll hear the chickens. They'll come." He began to take her on walks at dusk, not for hunting, but for listening. He taught her to distinguish the yipping bark of a coyote from the deeper, more mournful howl of a wolf. He showed her the tracks they left, the signs of their passage. He was teaching her to be vigilant, to be a guardian. The chickens were a responsibility, a small flock they had to protect. They were no longer 2 solitary individuals surviving side by side. They were partners in a shared and vulnerable enterprise. One morning, after a long night of listening to a coyote pack yipping restlessly in the distance, Clara was walking back from the well when she saw it. Growing from a crack in a large, flat rock was a single wildflower, a variety of desert marigold. It was a small, defiant splash of brilliant yellow against the monotonous brown of the landscape. It was a survivor, a thing of beauty that had found a way to bloom in the harshest of conditions. She looked at it for a long time. It felt like a reflection of the fragile, stubborn thing that was growing inside her own chest. On impulse, she carefully picked it, its stem thin and wiry. She carried it back to the cabin. Caleb was outside, mending a bridle. She went inside and placed the single, perfect flower in the center of the rough wooden table. She didn't put it in a cup of water. She just laid it there, a spot of silent, impossible color in the gloom. It was not a payment. It was not a bargain. It was a gift. It was her first attempt to add something to their world that wasn't born of pure necessity. It was an offering of beauty for its own sake. When Caleb came in for their midday meal, he stopped just inside the door. His eyes went to the table and settled on the flower. He stood there for a long moment, his face in shadow, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had exposed a part of herself, a soft and vulnerable impulse, and she was terrified he would crush it, or worse, ignore it. He walked to the table and sat down without a word. They ate their meal of bread and jerky, the small yellow flower lying between them. When they were finished, he stood and took his plate to the wash basin as usual. Then he came back to the table. He reached out and, with a surprising gentleness in his large, calloused fingers, he picked up the wildflower. He didn't smell it. He didn't examine it. He walked to the wall where his maps were tacked. He took one down, a detailed chart of the surrounding mountains. It was his most private possession, the key to his solitary life. He carefully unrolled it on the table. Then he took a small, leather-bound book from his saddlebag. It was a journal of sorts, filled with the same strange symbols he drew on his maps. He opened it to a clean page. He laid the yellow flower flat against the paper, closed the book, and pressed down, preserving her small gift within the pages of his own secret history. He rolled up his map and put the book back in his saddlebag. He never spoke of it. He never had to. From that day on, the nature of their shared work changed. It was no longer just a means of survival. It became a kind of conversation, a series of unspoken vows. Every time they hauled water together from the well, his bucket heavy, hers only half full but carried without complaint, it was a pledge of mutual effort. Every log he split and she stacked was a promise of shared warmth against the coming cold. When a storm loosened some of the sod on the roof and they worked together to repair it, his strong hands packing the mud and her smaller ones smoothing it. It was a vow of shared shelter. They were two broken people, a chipped cup and a scarred man, building a life in a land that did not want them. They were planting seeds in dry ground, building a fence against a hostile world, and in the quiet, rhythmic labor of their days, they were forging a bond more sacred and more binding than any words could ever make it. They were waiting for the rain, together. The rain came without warning. For weeks, the sky had been a merciless, empty blue, the sun a hammer beating the life from the land. The seeds they had planted lay in the dry earth like a dormant prayer. Then, one afternoon, the air grew thick and heavy, the light turning a strange, bruised yellow. The wind began to whisper, then moan, a low, mournful sound that snaked through the canyon and rattled the single window of the cabin. By nightfall, the moan had become a howl. It was a living thing, a predatory beast of air and sound, clawing at the log walls, testing the integrity of the sod roof. Clara had lived through storms before, but this was different. This wind had a voice, and it spoke the language of her deepest fears. It sounded like the loneliness of the open plains, the grief of an abandoned child, the raw, unrestrained anger of a violent man. She lay on her cot, the wool blanket pulled up to her chin, and listened. The cabin, which had become her sanctuary, suddenly felt fragile, a tiny, man-made shell in the face of the world's fury. She could see Caleb's small canvas tent through the window, illuminated by brief, silent flashes of lightning in the distance. It was being battered, bucking and straining against its ropes like a tethered animal. The sight of it, so exposed and vulnerable, did nothing to soothe her. Then came the thunder. It was not a distant rumble. It was a cataclysmic crack, a sound that seemed to split the very foundations of the earth. The sound was a physical blow, and it struck a chord of memory deep within her. It sounded like a gunshot. It sounded like the deafening roar of Silas's pistol, the sound that had preceded the searing pain in her shoulder. Her heart leaped into her throat, hammering against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut. But the image was burned into her mind, the sneering faces, the drawn guns, the world tilting as she fell. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, and she cried out, a small, choked sound swallowed by the storm. The past she had worked so hard to bury was being violently exhumed by the storm. Every gust of wind was a rough hand, every roar of thunder a shouted threat. She was no longer in Caleb's cabin. She was a child again, hiding under a thin blanket in a cold orphanage, listening to the drunken rages in the street outside. She was a young woman in a mining camp, listening to the brawls and the breaking of bottles, praying the violence would not turn its attention to her. She was alone, in the dark, and she was terrified. Her first instinct, honed by years of survival, was to endure it, to curl into a ball, to make herself small and silent, to wait for the danger to pass. Weakness was a lure. Crying out for help was an invitation for cruelty. But another voice, a newer, more fragile one, whispered in her mind. It was the voice that had chosen to stand in front of Caleb, the voice that had planted seeds in dry ground, the voice that had picked a single yellow flower. That voice told her she wasn't alone. Help was just outside the door. The thought was terrifying. To go to him, to admit her fear, was to make herself vulnerable in a way she never had before. It was an act of profound trust, and trust was a foreign country where she had never dared to travel. What if he saw her fear as a burden? What if he turned her away, annoyed at being disturbed? What if he saw her trembling and thought her weak, useless, a bad bargain after all? Another explosion of thunder, so close it shook the very floorboards, made the decision for her. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She could not endure this alone. She would rather face his rejection than the ghosts the storm had unleashed. Her feet were bare and cold on the packed earth floor. She moved like a phantom, her own shadow, reaching the heavy cabin door. Her hand, which had learned the heft of an axe and the strain of a plow, trembled as she reached for the wooden bolt. Sliding it back was a surrender. She was opening her fortress, not to an enemy, but to a possibility of comfort she felt she did not deserve. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the wall with a deafening crash. Rain, cold and sharp as needles, lashed her face and soaked the front of her thin nightdress. She peered through the deluge at the pale canvas of his tent. A lantern glowed dimly inside, a small, defiant point of light. She didn't call his name. She couldn't. She simply took a step out into the maelstrom, then another. The mud sucked at her bare feet, cold and greedy. The wind whipped her hair across her face and stole the breath from her lungs. In the few yards between the cabin and his tent, she was completely at the mercy of the storm. She didn't have to knock, as if sensing her presence. The flap of the tent was thrown open, and he was there, a dark, broad silhouette against the lantern light. He saw her, drenched and shivering, and in a single, fluid motion. He was out of the tent, his hand gripping her arm, pulling her back from the storm and into the shelter of the cabin. He slammed the door and shot the bolt, finally silencing the immediate roar of the wind. The only sounds now were the muffled thunder, the drumming of rain on the roof, and her own ragged, shallow breaths. He did not ask why she had come. He did not ask if she was all right. He knew. His pale eyes took in her trembling form, her soaked nightdress clinging to her skin, the raw terror in her eyes. He walked to the fireplace, added a log to the glowing embers, and stoked them back to life. Flames licked up the dry wood, casting a warm, dancing light that pushed the shadows back into the corners. The cabin was his space now, as it had been hers for all these weeks. He slept on a simple wooden bench near the hearth, a single blanket his only comfort. There was no bed, no cot, nothing but the hard floor and the fire. He gestured to the bench. It was not a command, just an invitation. Clara moved to the fireplace, drawn to its warmth. She was shaking uncontrollably, partly from cold, but mostly from the violent aftermath of her fear. She sat on one end of the bench, as far from him as she could get, and hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small. Caleb sat on the other end, his back to her, and stared into the fire. He gave her the gift of his silence, of his unpressuring presence. He did not try to comfort her with words or touch. He simply shared his fire, his small circle of light in the vast, roaring darkness. They sat that way for a long time, two solitary figures illuminated by the flames, while the storm raged outside. The warmth of the fire began to seep into her bones, chasing away the worst of the chill. But the trembling inside her did not stop. It was the trembling of a soul standing on a precipice. She was closer to him now than she had ever been, sharing the intimate quiet of a stormy night. The air was thick with unspoken things, with a history of violence and the fragile hope of a future. She had to speak. She had to define this moment, to claim it as her own. She had to be sure he understood that her presence here, her need, was not a debt to be repaid. It was not the silent, compliant offering of a possession. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a raw, quiet whisper, barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "If I say yes," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames, "it's not because I owe you." The words were a declaration of independence, the most courageous thing she had ever said. She was giving him her answer to the question he had asked in the desert, and again in this very room. A yes to this life, to this trust, to him. But she was setting the terms. It was a gift, freely given, or it was nothing at all. Caleb did not turn. For a long moment, the only sign he had heard was the slight tensing of the muscles in his broad back. He continued to stare into the fire, as if her words were embers he needed to study, to understand their heat and their light. Then, slowly, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, as deep and steady as the heart of the earth. "I'd never want it," he said, "if it wasn't yours to give." He had understood. He had heard not just her words, but the lifetime of pain and fear that lay beneath them. He had validated her, affirmed her, and in his quiet, simple way, had set her free. He wanted her choice, and only her choice. He wanted the one thing that had always and only been hers. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release. He turned then, and in the warm firelight, his weathered face was filled with a gravity and a gentleness she had never seen before. He did not move closer. He did not reach for her. He simply held out his hand, palm up, in the space between them. It was not a demand. It was a question, an offering. His hand was large, the knuckles scarred, the palm crisscrossed with the calloused lines of hard labor and harder fights. It was a hand that knew how to wield an axe and a pistol, how to break the earth and how to end a life. But now, it lay open and patient, waiting for her. Clara looked at his hand, and then she looked at her own, still pale and trembling in her lap. She thought of all the hands that had ever touched her, hands that had pushed and grabbed and taken, hands that had left bruises on her skin and scars on her soul. This hand was different. This hand had offered her water. It had tended her wound. It had worked beside her, building a fence, planting a garden. It had pressed a flower between the pages of a book. Slowly, hesitantly, she unfurled her fingers. She lifted her hand and placed it in his. The contact was electric. His skin was warm and rough against her own. His fingers closed around hers, not with the force of possession, but with a firm, steady strength that felt like an anchor. It was a simple touch, a plain and honest joining of two hands. It was not about desire. It was about acceptance. It was a promise, unspoken but perfectly understood. "You are safe. I am here." The storm still howled outside the cabin walls, but inside, in the quiet glow of the fire, it had no power. The thunder could crack the sky, but it could no longer break her. She held his hand. He held hers, and in that simple, profound connection, the darkness, both outside and within, finally lost its hold. They were just two people, no longer afraid of the night. The morning after the storm was a world reborn, The air, scrubbed clean by the rain, was crisp and cool and carried the rich, loamy scent of wet earth. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun cast long, gentle shadows across the canyon. The thirsty land had drunk its fill, and small puddles of water stood in the hollows of rocks, reflecting the sky like scattered pieces of a broken mirror. Inside the cabin, a new quiet had settled. It was different from the tense, watchful silence of the early days. This was a comfortable silence, a space that no longer needed to be filled. They had not spoken of what had passed between them in the heart of the storm, the shared fear, the whispered confession, the simple, profound act of holding hands. They did not need to. The knowledge of it was a tangible presence in the small room, a new and sturdy beam in the architecture of their life together. When Clara awoke on her cot, Caleb was already gone from the bench by the fire. She rose and, for the first time, felt no urgency, no need to immediately begin a task to prove her worth. She simply stood for a moment, listening to the soft dripping of water from the eaves. The world felt peaceful. She felt peaceful. She walked outside, her bare feet sinking slightly into the damp, cool earth, and she saw it. In the small, crooked rows she had plowed with her own 2 hands, a miracle had occurred. Tiny, vibrant green shoots were pushing their way up through the dark, wet soil, the corn, the beans, the squash. Their act of blind faith had been answered. The seeds had taken root. Life was beginning. A feeling she could not name swelled in her chest, so powerful it almost hurt. It was a fierce, protective joy, a sense of ownership that had nothing to do with price or barter. This was hers, theirs. She had helped bring this life into the world. A visitor arrived a week later. When the green shoots had grown into sturdy seedlings, he was a stranger to the canyon, a man who did not belong. He rode a tired-looking horse and wore a dusty black suit and a bowler hat, both of which seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. He looked like a man who lived his life by ledgers and laws, not by the sun and the seasons. Caleb saw him first. He was on the roof, patching the last of the spots the storm had loosened, and he went still, a hawk spotting a snake in the grass. Clara was in the garden, carefully pulling the small, opportunistic weeds from around the base of the cornstalks. She saw the direction of Caleb's gaze and looked up, her heart giving a familiar, fearful lurch at the sight of the stranger. The man reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin, his eyes darting nervously from the silent, imposing figure on the roof to the girl in the garden. He looked hot and uncomfortable. "Good day," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "I'm looking for a Miss Clara. I was told she might have passed through this way." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. No one knew that name, no one but the men who had owned her, and the last of them were dead or fled. Caleb slid down from the roof in a single, fluid motion, landing silently on his feet. He walked to stand between the stranger and Clara, a familiar position for him now. He did not speak, he simply waited, his presence a palpable warning. The man in the suit swallowed nervously, intimidated by the tall, silent man before him. "I mean no harm," he stammered, pulling a thick envelope from the inside of his coat. "I am a clerk for a legal firm in Santa Fe. I have been tasked with delivering this. It is a matter of some urgency." He held out the letter. It was sealed with a wax stamp, an official-looking document that felt like a relic from another world. Caleb did not take it. He looked at Clara, his pale eyes asking a silent question. It was her name the man had spoken. It was her decision. Her legs felt weak and shaky as she walked from the garden. The soil clung to her bare feet and the hem of her dress. She felt like a fraud, a wild thing being confronted by the civilized world. She took the envelope from the clerk's trembling hand. It was addressed in a neat, looping script to Miss Clara Maeve Abernathy. The name was a shock, a ghost from a past she didn't know she had. Abernathy. It meant nothing to her. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. The clerk seemed immensely relieved. My duty is done, then, he said, tipping his hat awkwardly. He turned his tired horse and began the long ride back the way he had come, eager to leave their strange, silent world behind. Clara stood with the letter in her hand, the heavy paper a foreign object against her calloused skin. Caleb watched her, his face unreadable. She broke the seal and unfolded the documents inside. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the core of it was clear. A woman named Eleanor Abernathy, her maternal grandmother, had passed away in the state of Ohio. Clara, as her only known living descendant, was the sole heir to her estate. The estate consisted of a small plot of land, 20 acres with a farmhouse, and a sum of money held in a bank. A sum that seemed impossibly large to a girl who had once been traded for 2 old guns. She was no longer just Clara. She was Clara Maeve Abernathy. She was a property owner. She had a name that was legally hers, a name that could be written in a book of deeds, a name that gave her a place in the world. The letter was a key, a miracle, an escape. It was a path back to the world she had been stolen from. She could leave this harsh, unforgiving land. She could go east, to a place with green trees and gentle rains. She could have a home, a real home, with floors and windows and a proper bed. She could be a lady. She could be safe. She could start again. A new life scrubbed clean of the brands and the scars of her past. It was everything she should have ever wanted. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on her cot, the legal papers clutched in her hand. The wind whispered outside, a gentle murmur now, no longer a threat. She looked around the small, dark cabin. She saw the rough-hewn walls that had sheltered her. She saw the hearth where she had huddled in fear and found comfort. She saw the maps on the wall, the charts of Caleb's secret world that had become the backdrop to her own. She thought of the life the letter offered, a life of safety and solitude in a green, distant land. And she thought of the life she had here, a life of back-breaking work, of constant vigilance, of planting seeds in a desert and praying for rain. A life with a silent, dangerous man who had shown her the meaning of honor by sparing a deer, who had seen her brokenness and called it his own, who had wanted nothing from her but her yes. The life in the East was a promise. This life was a reality. It was a reality she had helped to build with her own 2 hands. She had fenced it, plowed it, and planted it. She had defended it. It was hard and it was imperfect, like the chipped cup, but it held water. It was hers. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She built up the fire and made porridge, the familiar, lumpy gruel that had sustained her through her fever. When it was ready, she ladled it into 2 bowls and set them on the table. Then, she took the letter, her inheritance, her key to another world, and she folded it neatly. She laid it on the table beside Caleb's bowl. She did not wait for him to come in. She did not wait to see his reaction. She turned, walked out of the cabin, and went to the garden. The sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the canyons, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. She knelt in the damp, cool earth and began to weed, her fingers moving with a practiced, steady rhythm, tending to the small, precious lives she had sworn to protect. A few minutes later, she sensed his presence. She didn't have to look up to know he was there. He walked out of the cabin and stopped, standing a few feet behind her. He had seen the letter. He knew what it said. He knew the choice she had been given. They remained that way for a long time, in a silence that was deeper and more profound than any they had ever shared. The sun climbed higher, warming her back. The chickens began to cluck in their coop. The world went on with its ordinary, morning business. He was giving her the space to make her choice. He was honoring the freedom he had promised her from the very beginning. Finally, he spoke. He asked the same question he had asked her twice before, but this time, it was not a philosophical riddle or a response to her pain. This time, it was a simple, direct inquiry. The first true question he had ever asked of her. "What do you want?" His voice was quiet, stripped of everything but a raw, vulnerable sincerity. He was not asking what she wanted now, in this moment. He was asking what she wanted for all her moments to come. Clara stopped her work. She sat back on her heels, her hands covered in the dark, rich soil of their garden. She turned and looked up at him. The morning sun was behind him, casting his tall frame in silhouette, but she could see the look on his face, the tension in his jaw, the guarded hope in his pale eyes. She did not need to think. She did not need to weigh her options. The answer was already there, rooted in her heart as deeply as the corn was rooted in the earth. "You," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and this life, if you'll have me." A slow smile spread across Caleb Hawke's face. It was a rare and beautiful thing, like a desert flower blooming after a long-awaited rain. It transformed his harsh features, erasing the lines of pain and solitude, leaving only a quiet, profound joy. "I wanted your yes," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "And now I have it. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.